You may be seated. To those of you who are our regulars, we're on a bit of a baptism streak right now, which is a good thing. It's a good thing. And I want to promise you that my sermon is going to be short and brief, but I looked at last week's and it was 18 minutes. So I apologize in advance if we lose a little bit of time in the air here. Hang in there. This morning we look at the Beatitudes, and the Beatitudes are those famous passages that Christ declares in the Sermon on the Mount as it is recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, or the Sermon on the Plain as it is recorded in this morning's Gospel found in Luke. Now Matthew actually is the more kind of traditional. Those are the Beatitudes we all kind of remember. There are 9 of them. And they begin with, "Blessed are you." Blessed are you. And off he goes, listing the 9. I like Matthew's version better. It's just easier. Because in Luke pairs only 4 Beatitudes. Blessed are you who are poor, hungry, who weep, and when people hate you and exclude you and revile you. He pairs those 4 blessed are you with 4 woes. Woe to you who are rich, who are full, who laugh, and when people speak well of you. This combination that Luke does makes me kind of squeamish. It makes me turn in my seat a little bit because I always wonder, which category am I in? Am I in the first category? Am I being blessed in my poverty or in my hunger or in my grief or in my social setting? Or is Christ giving me a bit of an indictment? Woe to me because I am rich, because I am not hungry, because I am laughing, because I am well socially situated. It's a little challenging, and I used to really love the Beatitudes. I was kind of on a similar to our baptism kick. I was on a Beatitude kick for a number of years, and of course only a priest would get on such a kick, I think. And I was able to come up with ways to kind of get around this icky feeling. One of the ways that I came up with, and I didn't come up with it, I researched it, and I found other theologians who came up with it. One of the ways to look at it is to look at the Greek of the word blessed. Jesus is not here giving us a commandment. It's not like these are the new 10 commandments. Jesus is not telling us in an imperative to go and become poor or to become hungry or to start to grieve or to be socially persecuted. Jesus is instead using, it's called an indicative. It's showing us the way that things are. If you happen to find yourself poor, then yours is the kingdom of heaven. If you happen to find yourself hungry, you will be filled, and so on and so forth. And this seemed satisfying a couple years ago, but for whatever reason this week, I have had a hard time kind of allowing myself to circumvent the woe to you part of Luke's gospel. So I got to thinking a bit. And I got to thinking about how we read the Beatitudes, how we read blessing and woe. And we read them as static. And by that I mean either you're blessed or you're cursed. You're either receiving the blessing. It's a very passive activity. All we have to do is sit here and we will receive the blessing. We just open our hands and here come the blessings. Or if Jesus is talking to you, woe to you, well then you're kind of being cursed. It's like being scolded, right? And you sit there and you receive the scolding. But I think that passive way of understanding blessing and woe is kind of misplaced. And I have a different way that we could read it. And I came up with this way by reading the passage again and not actually looking so much at the Beatitudes themselves, the part where Jesus talks, but right beforehand. You see, the setting here in Luke's gospel is that Jesus has come with the 12 apostles to a level plain, so it's flat. And there are a whole bunch of people who come out to hear Jesus preach, to be healed of their disease, and to be cured of their unclean spirits. They're gathering in, and there's this energy that Jesus is throwing off. The people want to get close to Jesus, to touch him, because they know that if they touch him, they will be healed. It's this frenetic kind of energy. There's a, I don't want to say a mob mentality, but there are a lot of people gathering very close and moving about. in the midst of this energy. And then Luke says this very curious thing as he introduces the Beatitudes. Then Jesus looked up at his disciples. Now, I had always thought that this was because Jesus' head was kind of down for some reason, looking down, and so he just had to, look up, just pick up his head and look up. But as I began to think through it a little more creatively, I thought, I wonder where the disciples are in the midst of this crowd. Is it possible that the disciples have actually left the crowd at some level? Have they actually maybe gone farther away from Jesus? They're tired of these crowds of sick people and possessed people and poor people. They just don't have the energy to stand in that midst. And so maybe the disciples go off against the plain up to just some higher ground so they can watch what's going on. And so when when Luke says Jesus looked up, he may have literally been having to look up and out beyond the crowd to where the disciples were huddled, maybe even with their arms crossed. I wonder if Jesus is talking to the disciples here. Don't you see these people? Jesus says. These poor and hungry, sorrowful and rejected people. These people are blessed, Jesus said. And if you're rich or you're not hungry, you're laughing, you're well-positioned in society, well, woe to you. But not in a cursed way. You see, I think Jesus might be saying, in that word woe, to his disciples, he might be saying, watch out what happens out there, far away from me. Watch out what happens out there when you kind of stray away and you find yourself out there comforted by your wealth or by your food or by your laughter, by your social circles. Watch out there, because it can get a little bit difficult. And you might be presented with a choice. There might be something that happens where the woe becomes less passive and you become a much more active participant in your situation. There might be an opportunity for you to move and to come close, Jesus says. Now, I want to take a look at at the fourth beatitude here. Blessed are you when people hate you and when they exclude you, revile you, and defame you on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, for surely your reward is great in heaven. Now, I don't think heaven, I believe in heaven beyond death, yes. But I think heaven breaks into this world too. And I think that rejoicing, that leaping that happens, that reward sometimes happens in our very midst. We are presented with an opportunity to be blessed. I don't have many enemies. I can't even think of a modern enemy that I have, but I have an enemy in my history. He's not really an enemy. It was 10th grade. I was in high school. How much of an enemy can you make in 10th grade? And I was a new student at a boarding school outside of Philadelphia. I'd gone to public school in 9th grade, and I started in 10th grade at this boarding school that I ended up graduating from my senior year. And there was a gentleman at the other end of the dormitory, of the hall. We'll call him Corey. That's not his name, but we'll just call him Corey. And Corey was also a tall guy like me, and he had this confidence that he just exuded. He would walk around with this, kind of shoulders up and his head held high, and he would speak eloquently and use big words. And so after study hall, most nights, the hall would kind of gather, and I would always go down to Corey's room at first, because he would be pontificating about his recent read of Plato or Aristotle or Nietzsche, people I had never read or ever even heard of. It was an all-boys boarding school. That's why we were doing that. And we would gather around, and I would kind of be dumbfounded and just sit at his feet and listen to him. And then I would try to engage, but when I tried to engage, he was not nice. He would be dismissive. He would kind of undercut me, and I felt like I was attacked. I felt like Corey absolutely hated me, and I began to despise that confidence that he exuded. I began to really look at him and his snarky, kind of sarcastic attitude as an attack on me personally. I felt like Corey was my enemy because I felt like he was excluding me. And after a few weeks, I ended up not going into that room again. And when I would see him on campus, I would kind of keep my head down and not look at him in the eye, trying to not engage. Well, we had chapel regularly at school, and we had to go to chapel during the week, but on the weekends, there was an optional Eucharist service on a Sunday night. And I would go to this almost every week, and I would find myself in there with maybe a dozen or two other faculty and students gathered around with the priest, the chaplain who I really liked, and some of the religion teachers. And on this one particular Eucharist, a number of months into that 10th grade year, after the sermon and the prayers, the priest announced, "The peace of the Lord be with you and also with you." And as I shared peace with the people in front of me and the people to my side, I turned around. And there was Corey. And he had this grin on his face and his hand was outstretched, and I was so angry. I couldn't believe this was my space. You read Nietzsche. Why are you here? Must have snuck in. And it may have been social convention or muscle memory, but I reached out my hand and I grabbed his hand and I looked him in the eye and I said, "Peace be with you," not meaning a word of it. And the heavens didn't part. My heart wasn't, strangely warm like Wesley, but something did happen in that moment because I had a choice there. I had a choice about whether or not I was going to be blessed. Here was someone who had excluded me from my perspective. He had excluded me and reviled me, defamed me at some 10th grade level. And yet God presented this moment where the peace of Christ was going to kind of rise above that the peace of Christ was going to usher in this moment of heaven in the midst of kind of a sticky situation. And I had a choice about whether or not I actually wanted to be blessed. Or did I want to live in my anger and my fear? So I'm thankful that the church kind of programmed me to reach out my hand, to look him in the eye, and to declare a peace that wasn't really there at that moment, but yet became a moment that kind of stuck through the rest of our short-lived time together. Because a number of months later, it turns out that Corey wasn't that great, kind of confident demigod that I had thought he was, because over a spring fling weekend when we had a concert on campus, Corey and a number of other hallmates made some poor choices one night, and they ended up getting kicked out of school. And at that point, I was not happy that had happened, especially as they moved out and our hall became kind of a ghost town. It turns out that we don't necessarily find ourselves in one category or the other. We're not just poor or rich. We're not just hungry or filled. We're not just weeping or laughing. We're not just being spoken ill of or spoken well of. Because we all find ourselves in complex relationships and complex emotions where sometimes we are rich. And the challenge that Jesus gives his disciples is, don't get too comfortable way out there. Come close. You're going to be given a choice to let go of some of that because life is not lived just in the midst of our wealth. And at moments where we are poor, where we cannot go on, where we just have hit rock bottom, Jesus is there also providing a moment where we would be blessed. And so he speaks to the disciples from a distance, telling them to come close. He speaks to those who are close in, telling them that they might have an opportunity to be blessed. And in that way, he speaks to me this morning and to you as well. Whether you feel convicted by the woes or whether you feel comforted by the blessings, opportunities given by the Spirit will emerge that will make what was once a passive declaration of blessing and cursing into a moment, to an action that brings heaven close to earth and brings us closer to Jesus. Amen.